Chapter 3. It was the hour between tea and dinner when the spirit of the country house was resting, conscious of its virtue, half asleep. Having bathed and changed, George Pendyce took his betting book into the smoking room. In a nook devoted to literature, protected from draught and intrusion by a high leather screen, he sat down in an armchair and fell into a doze. With legs crossed, his chin resting on one hand, his comely figure relaxed, he exhaled fragrance of soap, as though in this perfect peace his soul were giving off its natural odor. His spirit, on the borderland of dreams, trembled with those faint stirrings of chivalry and aspiration, the outcome of physical well-being after a long day in the open air, the outcome of security from all that is unpleasant and fraught with danger. He was awakened by voices. "George is not a bad shot." "Gave a shocking exhibition at the last stand. Mrs. Bellew was with him. They were going over him like smoke. He couldn't touch a feather." It was Winlow's voice. A silence, then Thomas Brandwhite's. "A mistake, the ladies coming out. I never will have them myself." "What do you say, Sir James?" "Bad principle, very bad." A laugh, Thomas Brandwhite's laugh, the laugh of a man never quite sure of himself. "That fellow Bellew is a cracked chap. They call him the desperate character about here. Drinks like a fish and rides like the devil. She used to go pretty hard too. I've noticed there's always a couple like that in a hunting country. Did you ever see him? Thin, high-shouldered, white-faced chap with little dark eyes and a red mustache?" "She's still a young woman?" 30 or 32. "How was it they didn't get on?" The sound of a match being struck. "Case of the kettle and the pot." It's easy to see she's fond of admiration. Love of admiration plays old Harry with women. Winlow's leisurely tones again. "There was a child, I believe, and it died. And after that, I know there was some story, you could never get to the bottom of it. Bellew chucked his regiment in consequence. She's subject to moods, they say, when nothing's exciting enough. Must skate on thin ice, must have a man skating after her. If the poor devil weighs more than she does, in he goes. That's like her father, old Cheriton. I knew him at the club, one of the old sort of squires, married his second wife at 60 and buried her at 80. Old Claret and Piquet, they called him, had more children under the rose than any man in Devonshire. I saw him playing half-crown points the week before he died. It's in the blood. What's George's weight?" "It's no laughing matter, Brandwhite. There's time for 100 up before dinner if you care for a game, Winlow." The sound of chairs drawn back and of footsteps and the closing of a door. George was alone again, a spot of red in either of his cheeks. Those vague stirrings of chivalry and aspiration were gone, and gone that sense of well-earned ease. He got up, came out of his corner, and walked to and fro on the tiger skin before the fire. He lit a cigarette, threw it away, and lit another. Skating on thin ice. That would not stop him. Their gossip would not stop him, nor their sneers. They would but send him on the faster. He threw away the second cigarette. It was strange for him to go to the drawing room at this hour of the day, but he went. Opening the door quietly, he saw the long, pleasant room lighted with tall oil lamps, and Mrs. Bellew seated at the piano, singing. The tea things were still on a table at one end, but everyone had finished. As far away as might be, in the embrasure of the bay window, General Pendyce and Bee were playing chess. Grouped in the center of the room by one of the lamps, Lady Malden, Mrs. Winlow, and Mrs. Brandwhite had turned their faces towards the piano, and a sort of slight unwillingness or surprise showed on those faces, a sort of, "We were having a most interesting talk, I don't think we ought to have been stopped," expression. Before the fire, with his long legs outstretched, stood Gerald Pendyce, and a little apart, her dark eyes fixed on the singer and a piece of embroidery in her lap, sat Mrs. Pendyce, on the edge of whose skirt lay Roy, the old Skye Terrier. "But had I wist, before I lost, that love had been sae ill to win, I had locked my heart in a case of God, and penned it with a siller pen. Oh, wally, wally, but love be bonny, a little time while it is new, but when 'tis old, it waxeth cold, and fadeth away like morning dew. This was the song George heard, trembling and dying to the chords of the fine piano that was a little out of tune. He gazed at the singer, and though he was not musical, there came a look into his eyes that he quickly hid away. A slight murmur occurred in the center of the room, and from the fireplace Gerald called out, "Thanks, that's rippin'." The voice of General Pendyce rose in the bay window. "Check." Mrs. Pendyce, taking up her embroidery, on which a tear had dropped, said gently, "Thank you, dear, most charming." Mrs. Bellew left the piano and sat down beside her. George moved into the bay window. He knew nothing of chess. Indeed, he could not stand the game. But from here, without attracting attention, he could watch Mrs. Bellew. The air was drowsy and sweet-scented. A log of cedar wood had just been put on the fire. The voices of his mother and Mrs. Bellew, talking of what he could not hear, the voices of Lady Malden, Mrs. Brandwhite, and Gerald discussing some neighbors, of Mrs. Winlow dissenting or assenting in turn, all mingled in a comfortable, sleepy sound, clipped now and then by the voice of General Pendyce, calling "check," and of B saying, "Oh, uncle." A feeling of rage rose in him. Why should they all be so comfortable and cozy while this perpetual fire was burning in himself? And he fastened his moody eyes on her who was keeping him, thus dancing to her pipes.
Awkward movement, which shook the chess table. The general said behind him, "Look out, George. What? George went up to his mother. "Let's have a look at that, Mother." Mrs. Pendyce leaned back in her chair and handed up her work with a smile of pleased surprise. "My dear boy, you won't understand it a bit. It's for the front of my new frock." George took the piece of work. He did not understand it, but turning and twisting it, he could breathe the warmth of the woman he loved. In bending over the embroidery, he touched Mrs. Bellew's shoulder. It was not drawn away. A faint pressure seemed to answer his own. His mother's voice recalled him. "Oh, my needle, dear, it's so sweet of you, but perhaps—" George handed back the embroidery. Mrs. Bellew received it with a grateful look. It was the first time he had ever shown an interest in her work. Mrs. Bellew had taken up a palm leaf fan to screen her face from the fire. She said slowly, "If we win tomorrow, I'll embroider you something, George." "And if we lose?" Mrs. Bellew raised her eyes, and involuntarily George moved so that his mother could not see the sort of slow mesmerism that was in them. "If we lose," she said, "I shall sink into the earth. We must win, George." He gave an uneasy little laugh and glanced quickly at his mother. Mrs. Pendyce had begun to draw her needle in and out with a half-startled look on her face. "That's a most haunting little song you sang, dear." Mrs. Bellew answered, "The words are so true, aren't they?" George felt her eyes on him and tried to look at her, but those half-smiling, half-threatening eyes seemed to twist and turn him about as his hands had twisted and turned about his mother's embroidery. Again, across Mrs. Pendyce's face flitted that half-startled look. Suddenly, General Pendyce's voice was heard saying very loud, "Stale? Nonsense, B, nonsense. Why, damn me, so it is." A hum of voices from the center of the room covered up that outburst, and Gerald, stepping to the hearth, threw another cedar log on the fire. The smoke came out in a puff. Mrs. Pendyce leaned back in her chair, smiling and wrinkling her fine, thin nose. "Delicious," she said, but her eyes did not leave her son's face, and in them was still that vague alarm. Of all the places where, by a judicious admixture of whip and spur, oats and whiskey, horses are caused to place one leg before another with unnecessary rapidity, in order that men may exchange little pieces of metal with the greater freedom, Newmarket Heath is the topmost and merriest and best. This museum of the state of flux, the secret reason of horse racing being to afford an example of perpetual motion, no proper racing man having ever been found to regard either gains or losses in the light of an accomplished fact, this museum of the state of flux has a climate unrivaled for the production of the British temperament, not without a due proportion of that essential formative of character, east wind. It has at once the hottest sun, the coldest blizzards, the wettest rain of any place of its size in the three kingdoms. It tends, in advance even of the city of London, to the nurture and improvement of individualism, to that desirable, "I'll see you damned" state of mind which is the proud objective of every Englishman, and especially of every country gentleman. In a word, a mother to the self-reliant secretiveness that defies intrusion and forms an integral part in the Christianity of this country. Newmarket Heath is, beyond all others, the happy hunting ground of the landed classes. In the paddock, half an hour before the Rutlandshire Handicap was to be run, numbers of racing men were gathered in little knots of 2 and 3, describing to each other with every precaution the points of strength in the horses they had laid against, the points of weakness in the horses they had backed, or vice versa, together with the latest discrepancies of their trainers and jockeys. At the far end, George Pendyce, his trainer Blacksmith, and his jockey, Swells, were talking in low tones. Many people have observed with surprise the close-buttoned secretiveness of all who have to do with horses. It is no matter for wonder. The horse is one of those generous and somewhat careless animals that, if not taken firmly from the first, will surely give itself away. Essential to a man who has to do with horses is a complete closeness of physiognomy. Otherwise, the animal will never know what is expected of him. The more that is expected of him, the closer must be the expression of his friends, or a gray fiasco may have to be deplored. It was for these reasons that George's face wore more than its habitual composure, and the faces of his trainer and his jockey were alert, determined, and expressionless. Blacksmith, a little man, had in his hand a short, notched cane with which, contrary to expectation, he did not switch his legs. His eyelids drooped over his shrewd eyes, his upper lip advanced over the lower, and he wore no hair on his face. The jockey, Swells' pinched-up countenance, with jutting eyebrows and practically no cheeks, had, under George's racing cap of peacock blue, a subfusc hue like that of old furniture.
The Ambler had been bought out of the stud of Colonel Dorking, a man opposed on high grounds to the racing of 2-year-olds, and at the age of 3 had never run. Showing more than a suspicion of form in 1 or 2 home trials, he ran a bye in the feigned stakes when obviously not up to the mark, and was then withdrawn from the public gaze. The stable had from the start kept its eye on the Rutlandshire Handicap, and no sooner was Goodwood over than the commission was placed in the hands of Barneys, well known for their power to enlist at the most appropriate moment the sympathy of the public in a horse's favor. Almost coincidentally with the completion of the stable commission, it was found that the public were determined to support the Ambler at any price over 7 to 1. Barneys at once proceeded judiciously to lay off the stable money, and this having been done, George found that he stood to win £4,000 to nothing. If he had now chosen to bet this sum against the horse at the then current price of 8 to 1, it is obvious that he could have made an absolute certainty of £500, and the horse need never even have started. But George, who would have been glad enough of such a sum, was not the man to do this sort of thing. It was against the tenets of his creed. He believed, too, in his horse, and had enough of the totterage in him to like a race for a race's sake. Even when beaten, there was enjoyment to be had out of the imperturbability with which he could take that beating, out of a sense of superiority to men not quite so sportsmanlike as himself. "Come and see the nag saddled," he said to his brother Gerald. In one of the long line of boxes, the Ambler was awaiting his toilette, a dark brown horse, about 16 hands, with well-placed shoulders, straight hocks, a small head, and what is known as a rat tail. But of all his features, the most remarkable was his eye.
In the depths of that full, soft eye was an almost uncanny gleam, and when he turned it, half circled by a moon of white, and gave bystanders that look of strange comprehension, they felt that he saw to the bottom of all this that was going on around him. He was still but 3 years old, and had not yet attained the age when people apply to action the fruits of understanding. Yet there was little doubt that as he advanced in years he would manifest his disapproval of a system whereby men made money at his expense. And with that eye half circled by the moon, he looked at George, and in silence George looked back at him, strangely baffled by the horse's long, soft, wild gaze. On this heart beating deep within its warm, dark satin sheath, on the spirit gazing through that soft, wild eye, too much was hanging. And he turned away. "Mount, jockeys!" Through the crowd of hard-looking, hatted, muffled, two-legged men, those four-legged creatures in their chestnut bay and brown and satin nakedness, most beautiful in all the world, filed proudly past, as though going forth to death. The last vanished through the gate, the crowd dispersed. Down by the rails of Tattersall's, George stood alone. He had screwed himself into a corner whence he could watch through his long glasses that gay-colored shifting wheel at the end of the mile and more of turf. At this moment, so pregnant with the future, he could not bear the company of his fellows. "They're off!" He looked no longer, but hunched his shoulders, holding his elbows stiff that none might see what he was feeling. Behind him a man said, "The favorites beat. What's that in blue on the rails?" Out by himself on the far rails, out by himself, sweeping along like a homecoming bird, was the Ambler. And George's heart leapt, as a fish weeps of a summer evening out of a dark pool. "They'll never catch him. The Ambler wins. It's a walkover. The Ambler!" Silent amidst the shouting throng, George thought, "My horse! My horse!" And tears of pure emotion sprang into his eyes. For a full minute he stood quite still, then, instinctively adjusting hat and tie, made his way calmly to the paddock. He left it to his trainer to lead the Ambler back, and joined him at the weigh room. The little jockey was seated, nursing his saddle, negligent and saturnine, awaiting the words, "All right." Blacksmith said quietly, "Well, sir, we've pulled it off. 4 lengths. I've told Swells he does no more riding for me. There's a gold mine given away. What on earth was he about to come in by himself like that? We shan't get into the city now under 9 stone. It's enough to make a man cry." And looking at his trainer, George saw the little man's lips quiver. In his stall, streaked with sweat, his hind legs extended, fretting under the ministrations of the groom, the Ambler stayed the whisking of his head to look at his owner, and once more George met that long, proud, soft glance. He laid his gloved hand on the horse's lather-flecked neck. The Ambler tossed his head and turned it away. George came out into the open and made his way towards the stand. His trainer's words had instilled a drop of poison into his cup, a gold mine given away. He went up to Swells. On his lips were the words, "What made you give the show away like that?" He did not speak them, for in his soul he felt it would not become him to ask his jockey why he had not dissembled and won by a length. But the little jockey understood at once.
"Mr. Blacksmith's been at me, sir. You take my tip. He's a queer one, that horse. I thought it best to let him run his own race. Mark my words, he knows what's what. When they're like that, they're best let alone." A voice behind him said, "Well, George, congratulate you. Not the way I should have ridden the race myself. He should have lain off to the distance. Remarkable turn of speed, that horse. There's no riding nowadays." The squire and General Pendyce were standing there, erect and slim, unlike and yet so very much alike. The eyes of both of them seemed saying, "I shall differ from you. There are no two opinions about it. I shall differ from you." Behind them stood Mrs. Bellew. Her eyes could not keep still under their lashes,
and their light and color changed continually. George walked on slowly at her side. There was a look of triumph and softness about her. The color kept deepening in her cheeks, her figure swayed. They did not look at each other. Against the paddock railing stood a man in riding clothes, of spare figure, with a horseman's square, high shoulders, and thin, long legs a trifle bowed. His narrow, thin-lipped, freckled face, with close-cropped sandy hair and clipped red mustache, was of a strange, dead pallor. He followed the figures of George and his companion, with little fiery, dark brown eyes in which devils seemed to dance. Someone tapped him on the arm. "Hallo, Bellew. Had a good race?" "Devil take you, no! Come and have a drink." Still without looking at each other, George and Mrs. Bellew walked towards the gate. "I don't want to see any more. I should like to get away at once." "We'll go after this race. There's nothing running in the last." At the back of the grandstand, in the midst of all the hurrying crowd, he stopped. "Helen," he said. Mrs. Bellew raised her eyes and looked full into his. Long and cross-country as the drive from Royston railway station to Worsted Skeynes. To George Pendyce, driving the dog-cart with Helen Bellew beside him, it seemed but a minute. That strange minute when the heaven is opened and a vision shows between. To some men that vision comes but once, to some men many times. It comes after long winter when the blossom hangs. It comes after parched summer when the leaves are going gold, and of what hues it is painted, of frost white and fire, of wine and purple, of mountain flowers or the shadowy green of still deep pools, the seer alone can tell. But this is certain, the vision steals from him who looks on it all images of other things, all sense of law, of order, of the living past and the living present. It is the future, fair-scented, singing, jeweled, as when suddenly between high banks a bough of apple blossom hangs quivering in the wind loud with the song of bees. George Pendyce gazed before him at this vision over the grey mare's back, and she who sat beside him muffled in her fur was touching his arm with hers. And back to them the second groom, hugging himself above the road that slipped away beneath, saw another kind of vision, for he had won £5, and his eyes were closed. And the grey mare saw a vision of her warm, light stall, and the oats dropping between her manger bars, and fled with light hoofs along the lanes where the side lamps shot two moving gleams over dark beech hedges that rustled crisply in the northeast wind. Again and again she sneezed in the pleasure of that homeward flight, and the light foam of her nostrils flicked the faces of those behind, and they sat silent, thrilling at the touch of each other's arms, their cheeks glowing in the windy darkness, their eyes shining and fixed before them. The second groom awoke suddenly from his dream. "If I owned that horse, like Mr. George, and had such a topper as this here Mrs. Bellew beside me, would I be sitting there without a word?" But love doesn't end when the world tells you it should. In the next chapter, the truth will come to light, and one heart will have to break. Echoes of a Broken Promise, coming soon on this channel.